It's an Archaeodeath Interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest.
Archaeodeathlings, welcome to another Archaeodeath interview, and this time we're heading across to Norway to meet Marianne. Marianne, hello. Would you
Hi.
mind introducing yourself to our viewers and listeners?
No, delighted to. I'm Marianne Moen. I'm currently head of department at the Department of Archaeology at the Museum of Cultural History at the University of Oslo, which is a bit of a handful. But I'm also a researcher of the Viking Age, main interests gender and mortuary archaeology, and have dabbled in this and that, which I hope that we will cover today.
I'm so excited to talk to you on all manner of topics, and we have a plan. We have a plan, but who knows where it will go. But I mean, the first opening question, because I know that people watching this will be students of archaeology themselves and interested in how people get into the discipline. I mean, what was your route like getting into archaeology in the first place?
Oh, that's a very good question. It was long and it was tortured, and I did it twice. So I must like archaeology more than most people. No. I did my undergrad in archaeology just because, quite frankly, I thought it sounded like a lot of fun, and I was 19, so I wasn't really, thinking about what I wanted to do with my life. I just thought, oh, that sounds fun, and isn't Edinburgh lovely? So I moved to Edinburgh and did my undergrad there.
Oh, right.
It was
I
awesome.
didn't know that.
Yeah, it was really, really nice, but it's an awfully long time ago. I used to lie about how long it was ago because I thought I could get away with it, but I've recently stopped using things like Zoom filters, and I've had to realize that actually I can't lie about it anymore. So I graduated in 2005 with a Scottish MA in archaeology. Now I did some field work, but it just wasn't for me, to be honest. At that time, I couldn't hack the insecurity in terms of, earnings and job security and all of that. So I made the fairly tough choice to leave archaeology and go for a safe career in HR, which I actually stuck to for about 10 years. But after 10 years, I realized that job security is all very well, but it's terribly boring. No offense to any of my lovely HR colleagues. There were good times and I learned a lot, but I was just ready for the insecurity again. So I jumped ship. Yeah, jumped ship and went back to the University of Oslo to do a PhD in 2015. And so that's my second time of going back to archaeology. And it was just because I realized that it is literally more fun than anything else you can do with your working time. And considering that your working time is most of the time you spend awake, it should be fun. So that was it.
I'm sorry, I'm just reflecting on that. That is such an interesting and distinctive answer to the question. I'm just trying to process it, and I think there's so much that can be packed into that about careers and the love-hate relationship people in archaeology have with archaeology, but the love-hate relationship people have with any kind of work, and trying to work out what's right for you at different times. And I think a lot of people do feel this obsessive or this pressure to make a decision at 19, 20. Your career is fixed by 22, 23, 24, whatever. And I think that's really liberating to hear your story.
Yeah, well, hopefully it can help other people make similar choices. I mean, my point, I suppose, is that if you choose to leave archaeology, you can always come back, and there are ways of coming back. And yeah, it is okay to say that, do you know what, actually, at some points in life, the job insecurity is too much. And it was for me, but then I realized that, after a certain time, I was willing to do it again. And I've never looked back. And it does mean that, I do have a very renewed love of the subject, and I'm willing to put up with a lot. Not that I have to, my job is great.
No, but I mean, we all have to put up with challenges and issues, and with our discipline, our field of specialism, and you never know exactly when it's going to rise to the surface, do you? So that's the thing about academia. It's whether it's working in a museum setting or in a research, or a more teaching-based setting. There's all manner of challenges, but you've been doing so much interesting stuff, and I want to learn more about hopefully my listeners and viewers can learn more about your work on gender, because obviously this is a big issue within archaeology. I always get to, I remember as an undergraduate back in the day, I remember thought, yeah, this is all sorted. This has all been done. Gender archaeology is a core aspect of archaeological theory. I know that. I know its implications, both in terms of how we do our work and how we interpret the past. there we are, job done,
Yeah.
isn't it? And that was like,
Yeah.
and I'm here we all are still, you know, with these questions and these issues. So I mean, I'd love to
Absolutely.
hear whether you have an optimistic or pessimistic perspective, or what, you know, whether you'd like to start off perhaps by just saying how you've been contributing to that field, and then perhaps we can go into that more
Yeah.
self-reflective point later on.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's an awful lot to be said about it. And again, I think that's why I like to introduce my fairly weird CV, because I come from having sort of gotten into it twice. I've been able to see a very long-term development, but you know, coming to it with fresh eyes each time. So yes, I did gender archaeology as part of my Scottish MA, like one of those optional courses, you know, and it was mind-blowing. And I thought, this is amazing, and the future is bright, and in 20 years' time everything will be looking different. And here I am 20 years later going, oh, actually no, still sucks a bit, doesn't it? I never stopped doing gender. So I wrote my first Scottish master's dissertation on gender and archaeology, and then I went back and wrote another master's in order to qualify for a PhD at the University of Oslo, and that was also about gender in the landscape. And then I did my PhD on gender in the landscape, and then I went on to work on human sacrifice. But you know what? I made it about gender as well. So everything I do turns to gender. I have been very frustrated with what I've experienced as the lack of progress, if that's okay to say. But that is unfair, because there is an awful lot of really good work being done. But I just felt when I came back into academia in 2015, I was met with a lot of people who were like, but we did this in the 90s, we're sorted, we did gender. And I'm like, yeah, but you can't just put a lid on it and say that it's done, because that's not how
That
it
was a
works.
theme, that was a fad.
Yes.
We move on.
Yeah, exactly. But in the time since, I think that feeling has gone away, and there is now more acceptance again that gender is something we need to talk about, and we're talking about it in different ways. So I recently co-edited a book with my lovely colleague in Pedersen at the university, a Routledge Handbook of Gender Archaeology, and I have to say that that was a 4-year process, and it was a lot of work, obviously. But what it left me with was a feeling of optimism and hope, because I do think that we are progressing. So yeah, that was a long answer.
No, but it's true, isn't it? People try to put a lid on topics and say
Yes.
we moved on. I remember, or sorry, I shouldn't even say this really, but I remember when we were talking about gender issues as a postgraduate, so, and I remember one of my colleagues go, "I don't do gender," as if it's like a bracketed. I mean, it is at one level a bracketed niche archaeological theory topic, but it's not something you just put aside, either in terms of a stage in your career or in terms, you know, it affects us all. It's not like I don't. And we mocked him for it, but it was like it became a sort of stock line to mock this character. He goes, "No, I don't do gender," you know. But it actually encapsulates the way a lot of people think about these topics and how they affect the discipline, and yeah.
And the thing is, if you don't do gender, that means that you do gender a lot more
Yeah,
than actually some
exactly.
people who do gender do it. So yeah, there is
Yeah.
that.
So it's something you found still there's resistance to particular ideas in terms of how we think about the archaeological record, or how we do our practice, or both. Where do you think the resistance or the issues now lie, even if you are more optimistic?
Well, I think there's a lot, to be honest. And it's quite complicated, because you know, you can approach it from so many different sides. I think in many ways, some of it is sort of institutionalized habits in terms of things like basic things like citation practices.
Yeah.
And it's so easy when you're pushed for time and you're writing an article that you just go, right, okay, well, I'll just reference the usual suspects for this and this theory.
Usual suspects, yeah.
Chances are that a feminist archaeologist will have said something similar prior to the usual suspect. So it's just about, you know, trying to be a bit more aware in things like that, I think helps. So there is that sort of but yeah, I think it's institutionalized habits really in like who we reference for what theories, and maybe they need readdressing.
Yes.
But then I also think that in many ways, and I contribute to it myself, so I'm as guilty as anyone else, but I think that tendency to sort of bracket gender archaeology as something not part of a wider picture, I find it quite frustrating, especially as I get older and more grumpy. So, you know, looking over themes for big conferences, for instance, they'll have a big overarching theme on theoretical archaeology, and gender will be part of it. I like, but it should be part of everything. You shouldn't shoebox it. And I have argued in the past, and I still argue that until we are at a better place in terms of archaeological biases in the knowledge that we produce. We still need to put the focus on gender, but I'm not sure that we need to put the focus on it as a separate topic.
Yes, it should be everywhere and sort of
Yes,
lurking in the
all over.
baked in, or whatever metaphor you want
Yes.
to use. You know,
Mm.
that's a really important point, I think. And so, how does that play out with the niche, weird, strange sub discipline of Viking archaeology? You know, if I can characterize it that way, I hope that's not too offensive. But I always
Oh,
think of it
God.
as a sort of weird sort of sub area of an early medieval archaeology, which is itself a sub area of medieval archaeology. So this is where I try and explain it to students and try and, you know.
That's so funny. And you know what? That is exactly how I experienced it when I was living and working in the UK. But here it's just normal archaeology.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
I
Well,
mean,
maybe that's just
everybody
that's
does
my
it.
bias then, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, so the Vikings do tend to be very manly, don't they? They were full of
Yeah,
men doing man things. Um,
absolutely. All the
hmm,
time,
all the
24/7.
time. So manly, so many men. And that is still a thing. I'm sort of sad to say. Uh, it's sort of funny because some of the earliest gender archaeology was done in Viking studies, and some of the really influential work that still remains current to this day was published in the 80s and 90s, and it was done within, Viking studies.
Yeah.
But then you still get books published in the last couple of years where you can open and check the table of contents, and it will have like society and class and all of these things in different chapters, and then they'll have a chapter on women, and you're like, well, okay, but do you not think that maybe they were also part of society? And my favorite is when it's women and children together,
Yeah.
because they're naturally like this. So yeah, it is still very much a thing. The Viking Age is still so manly, and I like to reference Judith Yeshes, sorry,
Yeah.
1991 book, obviously, because everybody does, because it's got some very quotable quotes when she writes that the Viking Age is irredeemably male, and it's just like, well, it still is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, there's so many men. And the women, if they're there, they're just there to serve their menfolk. And that is a gross mischaracterization of a lot of work that's being done, but the overarching picture is still that there isn't quite the level of gender awareness that we should have, I
I mean,
think.
the way I think about it, and you please correct me, I defer utterly to your experience, but the way I've tried to approach it and explain it to students is that it's kind of it's a blessing and a curse that it has such a popular appeal,
Yes.
and we have so many great popular syntheses, more than perhaps, like, you can't pick up a book on the Neolithic in the same way, despite all many great work on the Neolithic. I just picked on that out of the air, but it doesn't quite have that sort of soundbitey, easy approach, and because of that, people want to do that popular writing, but it so often gets channeled into those traditional modes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then seafaring men, war
All the
men,
men.
and it just goes down those standard topics, and that's what
Mm.
publishers want, and that's what. So I don't know but you think it would be a bit better by now, but I don't know, but
It
your
is.
work has certainly contributed towards that.
Oh, thank you. No, it is better, and there is lots of great work, and I reference and love your work on like the public perception of Vikings a lot, because I think we underestimate how much that influences the work that we produce as scholars as well. It's easy to think, isn't it, that as academics we're sort of divorced from wider society and we just sit here and produce wonderful knowledge, but actually there are so many levels on which we have to be in constant dialogue with the public perception of the Vikings. And it is funny. And, one of my favorite examples of this is my own journey towards funding a project. So, when I was a young and promising academic a few years ago, I sent in so many funding applications on gender, and funding applications on things like intersectional gender and on feminism. And I put all those things in the titles, and I never got funding. And then I submitted a funding application about warriors and Vikings, and boom, I got money. Because it's just that.
What are the odds?
I know, and it's a great project. I'm not saying that it is a fantastic project, and we do talk about gender. But it's just about angling your work, and it does end up playing on and with people's expectations. Yeah.
I mean, do you feel that your job has been sort of correcting or challenging, or do you feel that really that's not a fair characterization of how you've been writing on gender in the Viking Age. I mean, what type of things do you think we've been able to successfully challenge, or do you think there are still entrenched sort of, is it just a male domination of the narrative, or is there
Yeah.
specific things that you still feel we've got, I don't know, have a go at, we've still got problems with?
I think there are part of the public ownership of the Viking Age, I think, is that people, also academics, end up with very strong relationships with it.
Yes.
It is not a distant past to us. And, I think we agree very much on this. So you've certainly written about it as well. And
Yeah.
I think that those strong relationships, they are quite apparent in academia as well. And I have experienced a certain lack of what should we say, distrust in my narratives, where people are like, but we know it wasn't like that. And I'm like, well, do we know it wasn't like that?
Yes.
I'm not sure, because I'm not sure the archaeology always supports the overarching narratives of like gender division in the Viking Age. Well, I'm sure they don't, is my opinion. So there is a lot of resistance to that, I think, because people feel they know the Viking Age. And I think that's a very strong feeling, and especially in the Scandinavian countries, where it's part of our heritage. I remember learning about the Viking Age when I was, I don't know, 8.
Yes.
And you're taught about it as if like, this is our history, people. So you end up having really strong ties to it, which I think creates quite an interesting discrepancy between like the academic you and the you that relates to heritage. And there's so much to work on there.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be constantly self-reflective of, why do I hate this, or why do I like this, or why am I not criticizing this? And I'm constantly going, oh yeah, but I'm not consistent here because I had to go at that, and I'm not going at that, and I spend myself in a lot of loops going through. But I think that's healthy to a degree. I suppose that's the way we've got to be, trying to overcome these biases. I mean, I remember a phrase said to me, not about the Vikings, but I gave a conference presentation once, and a really nice guy, and it's not about him, came up to me and said, and this was about gender, but not about the Viking Age. And he said, why am I not convinced? And I said, and I cheekily said, well, because Gregory of Tours didn't write that down, or the Venerable Bede. I don't know, but I've just shown you the archaeological patterns of the data of the burials, and I was a bit arsey in that response. But honestly, it's that level. It's like, yeah, you can say all that. Yeah, well, I'm happy to have all that. But at the end of the day, we know what it was like, and it was about Viking ships, raid, and that's, so it's almost like there's that, oh, we'll tolerate the intolerable.
Yes.
But we know what it was really like, and that really annoys me, that it's not being, sorry.
I agree. And I've often felt like I've, in many ways, at some points, felt like the token angry feminist. I'm tolerated. They invite me. They accept my abstracts, and they're happy to listen. But I don't know. I don't feel that I've changed a lot of people's minds. Maybe that's not my job. Maybe it's just to keep talking about things. Yeah, because you do get those sort of, but what about this? And you're like, yeah, but what I'm saying is maybe there are different ways of looking at the past. And
yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I think at the moment the whole world feels like just trying to tread water is more than good enough, because there's so much pushback on every front, on every aspect of our attempts to try and educate and research. But so I think we should just take that as a win, really. Even though it's not far from ideal. I mean, is there any other points you would like to make about gender before we perhaps shift to some of the other things you've been tackling?
I'll still make it about gender, so that's all right.
Let's stick with gender, but talk about human sacrifice.
Oh, yes.
I'd love to hear about your work on human sacrifice, having debunked some of our preconceived ideas about gender in the Viking Age. What about gender and human sacrifice? What about how common was human sacrifice? I mean, what's your where are you at with your thinking on all this?
Oh, it's good. I first of all, I think that one of the many things that I took from my postdoc in human sacrifice is how great a conversation starter it is. I mean, how often do you get to say that you'd love to hear about my work on human sacrifice? And I can go, yes, my human sacrifice phase was lovely, very rewarding. Sorry. No, It's complicated, isn't it? So there is this narrative that the Vikings sacrificed, and I think to a certain degree they certainly did, because Viking religion is all about sacrifice. They loved sacrificing. The horses were,
Yeah.
all the sacrifices all the time. But I think when it comes to human sacrifice, you need to have a bit of a conversation about what you mean by human. And so this is my main takeaway from my dabbling in human sacrifice, is that human is a relative term if what you mean is a person. So the project I was working on was called Human Sacrifice and Value. And I sort of turned that into looking at, personhood and things like that. When it comes to human sacrifice in the Viking Age, there are a number of written sources, as I'm sure you know, and they are fairly clear, pointing towards various forms of human sacrifice. But none of them are without issues, and none of them are without sort of things that you can challenge. I'll get back to that in a minute. But also the problem, well, it's not a problem, but in archaeology, you can never answer the question of whether or not someone is a sacrifice. You just can't. So we have burials that we think are human sacrifices, but then once you start looking at them, they could be so many more things. And I'm sure you're as familiar with all of these as I am. But there are the double graves found, for instance, where one body is buried face down, or they've been decapitated, or things like that. And you can interpret that as a human sacrifice, and to some extent, I think it is justifiable. But then it could be any number of other things as well. But that's the problem with archaeology. We never know. And that's also not the problem. That's why it's fun, isn't it?
But that links together what we're talking about with gender, is that people want a cozy, easy answer, both in academia and in popular culture. And your work is trying to doing the work. They're doing the good work of problematizing those issues, isn't it? I have no fixed view on these topics, but I keep trying to sort of get my head around them and teach about them. And I end up going, there seems to be evidence of people being killed and deposited in ritualized fashions. Do we call that human sacrifice or not? Here's a paper by Moen, and her argument is this. And that's the way I don't have skin in the game, so to speak. That's probably not the best metaphor for thinking about it, it's a really sensitive issue, and it matters, but we can't be too definitive. Is that a fair thing to say?
That is very much a fair thing to say, and I think that reflects my own views on it, because I think that sacrifice studies is also quite funny, because people again have very strong feelings about sacrifice, and there is such a thing as the sacrifice purist, which again is a term that I love using. Sacrifice purists believe that unless it is a killing dedicated to a god, it isn't a sacrifice. Whereas I think that the Vikings sacrificed, and they sacrificed humans. Whether or not they were recognized as persons is a different discussion, but that they did at times kill human beings for purposes that we can equate to something like sacrifice, which is a very long way of saying that, I do think they sacrificed, but I don't think they necessarily killed people for the gods. I think the Vikings were hugely pragmatic, and they killed for gain. As in, I give you this sacrifice, you give me something back. And that's how I think we can read a lot of the things into the sources. But then you do have, the very famous ones, like Ibn Fadlan, which everybody talks about, and for good reason, because it is fantastic, with the sacrificed slave girl and the burial of a chieftain. But the thing is that a sacrifice purist would not accept that as a sacrifice, because attendant sacrifices are not apparently sacrifices, because they're not killed for the gods. Yeah, there you go. So you can end up in some really weird rabbit holes when you have these things. I think when it comes to Ibn Fadlan, there's a lot to be said, and one of the problems is that it's people let it influence their narratives a lot when it comes to the archaeological record, and it's something that I was very interested in, still am actually, is how we tend to use that as a template to try and interpret some mortuary evidence, and it doesn't often fit. So people have used it to try and explain Ulsberg, and Ulsberg is.
It's a ship involved. What else can you say?
There's a ship and there's ladies, and what are you going to
do?
And it just doesn't fit. There is nothing in Ulsberg to indicate a sacrifice, as far as I can see. You know, they seem to be two people of equal social status buried together.
Oh, you mean? Oh, so I hadn't even made that connection. You meant in terms of the women are the
Mm,
sacrifices because the ship.
mm,
Oh
yeah,
God, right? Yes, of course. Right. Okay. Sorry.
yeah.
I'll shut up. Go on. Go on,
No, no,
please.
no, no, no. I just it because it's one of those stories that it's become quite entrenched. And when I started the project, other people on the project were very keen to write about Augsburg as a sacrifice, and I said, but it's not a sacrifice. There is nothing there to tell us it's a sacrifice. It doesn't look like a sacrifice, and it doesn't smell like a sacrifice, and there is nothing to say that one of these people was killed to go with the other,
Oh,
because they're buried with equal wealth. And you know, and then you've got the whole issue of how you would know if it's a sacrifice, but that's another ballgame. But then you've also got things like Malatia on the Isle of Man with
yes.
the yeah, you know that.
Yeah.
It's a great burial, isn't there? So, you know, you've got a male buried in the bottom, and then man, right at the top there is the body of a woman, and she seems to have been killed violently. And that's been interpreted as a sacrifice. But again, it could be a sacrifice, but it could be so many other things as well.
Mm.
One of the things that I'm really interested in is why nobody's ever dated the secondary burial
Oh,
there.
yeah, I wondered that. Yeah.
Why? It would
Mm.
be obvious to date that, because if they're contemporary, then sacrifice would be a fairly logical explanation, but we don't know if they are.
Mm.
And we know that mounds are reused.
Yeah.
So I just think that one of the problems with sacrifice studies in the Viking Age is that we do tend to turn to Inverland as soon as we can, because it's a lovely story. Well, it's not a lovely story, it's actually quite a harrowing story, but you know what I
Mm.
mean. It makes sense, and we like things that make sense. But a lot of the time, the archaeological record is a lot more messy than that.
But it's so unsettling to conceptualize, and I mean, I have a natural reaction to hearing about societies that don't treat some people as human, but then we live in an international community where some people are not treated in the same way as other people all the time. So
Yes.
it involves us confronting ourselves as well as past people, and I suppose that is deeply unsettling, isn't it, to realize that some people are just not going to be and we'll sacrifice 10 of these are prized possessions that happen to be people, you know, or whatever, or you know, and I suppose that does, it's a very uncomfortable area, isn't it, really?
It is a very uncomfortable area, but it is also a very interesting one, and it's is one of those convergences of archaeology and modern life that I find absolutely fascinating. So I wanted to write an opinion piece about modern sacrifice that I was heartily discouraged by certain people in my project, and they were probably right. But I think if you look at sacrifice as the exchange of human lives for your own comfort, then you could look at things like, because this was during the peak of the refugee crisis that I was
Yes.
working on, for instance. I think, what is that if not sacrifice for us to keep our lifestyles, for us to keep our material comforts? But you know, you're moving into really contentious political territory there. But I do think it creates quite an interesting dialogue of past and present behaviour, because well, we have to admit that not all humans are persons today either, to us.
No.
I'm sure they are to themselves, and I'm sure they were in the Viking Age as well. It's one of those conversations that frustrate me a little bit, actually, when we talk about personhood, because what we also need to talk about is, but what does that mean for the person who is not defined as a person? I'm sure they define themselves as a person, right? Yeah, anyway.
But it's exactly the point you're making, is that a lot of our theoretical frameworks do tend to sort of be very woolly and not get to some of the hard stark realities, that a lot of these constructions of what it is to be a aristocratic person in the Bronze Age or the Neolithic or the 18th century are about disenfranchising others from those rights and opportunities, and that can be on gender lines and status lines and all manner of things, and it's quite unsettling territory when you realize that, yeah, and that often gets missed at least in some of the discussions.
I think you're absolutely right there, and I think that taking a step back and sort of asking what the world looked like from the disenfranchised people is something that we need to be better at in archaeology, because we tend to create these, well, I think, and perhaps I'm being unfair now, but a lot of the stuff that I read is about who were persons and who were not, but I'm missing what was the experience like from the people classified as non-persons, because like I say, I'm pretty sure they did not understand themselves as non-persons.
Well, all I can say is that in a brief social media discussion of something very much like this, the best place people could recourse to illustrate my point about something not exactly like this, but about slavery, enslaved people in the Viking Age was the comedy show Norseman or Viking. So that was their way of people, and that was the way I sort of took it forward, because oh right, that's what you mean, because so many of the other representations of the Viking Age don't even, I mean, it's obviously very deliberately on the nose and very stereotyped, but at least it opens that conversation in a crude and comedic way to
Absolutely.
that we're often overlooking, but yeah, I mean, so do you think that a lot of it was, when we're looking at societies in the Viking Age that you're looking at, we're not looking at, as I've seen you write about, we're not looking at sort of moments of mass state organized unaliving of thousands of people, or everyone going, it's for the gods, with a dramatic, sort of Viking TV show type everything, and then suddenly gruesome things happen and someone's smiling going ha, ha, ha. It's not that kind of Hollywood cheesy drama. It's much more specific and rare, and is that a fair thing to say?
I think so, definitely. So I think that sacrifice was definitely on the agenda. Human sacrifice, rare, but I think it was part of the ritual language, and I think it was recognized. But I think it was also very specific, very local, and definitely quite sort of isolated. I don't think it was something that happened on a very common scale. No, yeah, I think that's a fair summary.
Again, I'd love to hear your reaction to my crude attempt to synopsize things for students and broader audiences. But one of the things I've been trying to make this point, conveying that point that what I've learned from your work is to say, well, if anybody in the Viking Age was obsessed with taking heads and brutal massacres, it's the Christian West Saxons, from our evidence at the moment. I'm not saying they're the only ones, but if you want to just to push back against this idea of the pagan Norsemen with their obsession with drinking from skulls and
all the skulls. It's very manly to drink from skulls, actually.
Apparently.
It's one of the manliest things you can do. Yeah, so final point, perhaps, I don't know if we're straying off from sacrifice, but one of the things that I also got really interested in when it comes to sacrifice is how stories of mass sacrifice, and like, oh my god, they sacrificed so many people and there were rivers of blood and all of that, they tend to be written by other people. They tend to be written by outsiders, and they tend to be written by outsiders with an agenda. So if you think about the main stories of sacrifice over the last few, millennia, I suppose, you've got, Tacitus writing about the Germans who were really keen on sacrifice. Who was he? And why would he write such a thing, wanting to other the Germanic tribes? And then you've got Christian missionaries writing about their meetings with Vikings, where they were, hanging people from trees all over the place every 9 years. But, these are Christian writers with a specific agenda at othering the Vikings. And if you move forward, you've got the whole conquistador situation in South and Central America, where apparently they were sacrificing so many people that they basically built their houses out of skulls. Now, that's a whole different debate, but again, it turns into this desire to other, because it becomes a thing where the other sacrifices, where the people writing the narratives, they're merely, for instance, killing or colonizing. And you get also stories going up into fairly recent times. So a lot of the British colonial stories of Africa, for instance, full of sacrifice. And the main gist of most of those stories is, look, we're doing them a favor by colonizing them and bringing some civilization to stop them being cannibals who sacrifice. And that's a thing that repeats, and I think you find it, especially in like the mass sacrifice stories of the Vikings as well. Now, bearing in mind, I'm not saying that the Vikings were innocent, lovely people who didn't sacrifice. No. I'm just saying that I think that sort of institutionalized, they killed lots of people all the time, is most likely a fabrication meant to sort of other their culture.
So I mean, this is the point, is that first and foremost we have to engage with the what, not necessarily just the primary written sources, but our archaeological narratives. Why are we fixating on these? Why are we giving precedent to this? And it's part of that colonial reflex, isn't it? Or echoes of that colonial justification of a civilizing process.
Absolutely.
That's really interesting.
And that is so interesting, because I think that is an underlying issue throughout archaeology. We like stories that make us better, don't we? If you see what I'm saying, like, we like a past that we can hold up as an example and go, but look, we're really awesome now.
I mean, that's the weird thing about the Vikings, isn't it? Is that at one level, popular culture wants them to be victims of colonization by evil Christians, but
Mm,
also simultaneously we want to celebrate them being colonizers, and so there's this weird game we play from different national and regional perspectives, whether
yeah.
from a British perspective, or a Norwegian or wherever in the world. And it's
Mm,
so that's why I think they're so seductive, is that they're simultaneously so many things to so many people in terms of,
yeah.
but and gender is absolutely central too. And
Mm,
I mean, skipping back to, well, it links both topics, is this whole issue of how women are commodified in popular culture representations of the Vikings, and
yeah.
women are in constant peril of the Vikings, and in constantly the Vikings are full of women who are being men doing men
Yes.
things. And there's all sorts, and or women are being empowered by stirring a pot, or there's just, again, there's multiple stereotypes at play, aren't there? I mean,
Oh, so
that's what
many.
I guess a lot of what your work is debunking, from the very wealthiest women in the past to those that are treated as objects for sacrifice.
Mm.
Is that something you feel is fair?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. I don't know. I mean, from the there is a lot of sort of stereotyping of the Vikings. We do tend to be like put representations into these boxes, don't we? And then create
Yeah.
the stories that we want from them. And it is a very grateful subject because they're so well known and everybody knows the Vikings. But I also think it plays a massive part in like ongoing heritage narratives, especially in the Scandinavian countries, I suppose, but also elsewhere, that we create a past that we like, and we like it for different reasons. Some people want the Vikings to be super butch colonizers, and some people want them to be sensitive and touchy-feely and new agey. And if they can be all things to all people, then what I'm thinking is that we probably haven't quite got the narrative right.
And this leads us on to nicely to, how we represent the Vikings, because I mean this is something I'm really interested in, and it's certainly lots of people have addressed in different aspects, from heritage and literary perspectives, and everything from the invention of the horned helmet through to, and then the debunking of the horned helmet, through to how we portray warriors, or you know different kinds of women's role. I mean, and then of course the death rituals themselves. And
Mm.
I'd love to hear your views on all of that, on how the challenges of bringing this to life, of representing the Viking Age, reconstructing their funerals in particular.
As that is a tough one, isn't it? I mean, ooh, yes, where to start? I think. Right, I just have to think. I have to think.
No,
Right,
that's
so are
fine.
we
I didn't
talking?
helpfully. Yeah.
Are we talking like reconstructions? Or are we talking museum representations? Or are we talking how we disseminate to a wider audience? Because I think
Okay,
all of
but
those things play
let's
into
start. Yeah, I should have started off with, I went stuff.
it.
I suppose what I should let's start off. I mean, I mean, this whole challenge of, we now have a situation where we hundreds of scholars have analysed graves. We have museums that show the objects, and yet now, thanks to the internet, there's
Mhm.
probably only a handful of images of the accurate reconstruction images of a Viking funerary scene
Yes.
that are everywhere, and that is both a blessing and a curse. So what do we, it's good that we've got artists working with us to reconstruct how these funerals look, but what challenges does that bring, Marianne?
Mm. Right. Yes, got it now. Lots of challenges and lots of opportunities. And I think, yes, you're right, it is a blessing and a curse. But I think there's also a lot of things that we have to be aware of. And one of them is the power of images. You basically take an incredibly complex story and you distill it into a frozen in time representation a lot of the time, which is massively problematic, because I think what we do when we create, for instance, reconstruction drawings of a funeral, is we do the end product. We draw what we find. Sometimes you might get a little bit more creative and you might add in some of the things that we don't find, like, the organic materials and all of that. But at the end of the day, we are creating something from an archaeologist's gaze. And
Mm.
I think that's one of the most interesting things when you start working on this, is that you end up having to confront your own gaze a lot, because not only do we reconstruct what it is we find, but we also reconstruct sort of what we think we're seeing, if that makes sense. And I think it can if done correctly and in a proper dialogue with an artist, it can make you confront a lot of your own preconceived notions of what a burial is and how it was created and who inhabited it. And the choices that you make they can seem so innocent, but they are actually quite influential. So reconstruction drawings of burials, there's a lot that plays into it, and you see all these drawings of buried ladies with flowing hair, and you're like, we don't find the hair. Why? What is the hair doing there?
Yeah.
And their long eyelashes, and you're like, but again, we don't know that. This is something we're putting in. It's really interesting. So I worked on a reconstruction drawing on one of the Band graves with Neil Price and in Pedersen a few years ago. And one of the most fascinating things is that when you start delving into the actual excavation report, it is so unclear. But it turns out that everybody thinks they know that grave because of the reconstruction drawings. And you're like, yes, so you have created this narrative that people buy into, which is the end product. It's a neat and tidy representation of 3 people in a boat and some sacrificed animals and some weaponry and what may or may not be a baby buried alongside one of the adults. But actually, if you go back to the excavation notes, it's a mess. I spent weeks delving into the archives for this, and I wanted to find the excavation diary. In the end, I found what I think is it, not the typewritten notes, because those are quite easy to get hold of, but the actual handwritten site diary. And I think I found the right one, and it goes, day 1, we have uncovered a house. Day 2, it's not a house, it's a grave. It's really complicated. And that's it.
Well, that's that sorted.
That's that sorted, right? Because there are so many questions. So that baby, we don't know if it's a baby. The excavator's like maybe a small mammal or maybe a baby. Right. Yep, the shields are like, we think they were placed like this, but actually we're not sure. They could have been disturbed by later things. The deposition was probably staged. That is noted by the excavators as well. And they think that the 2 women in that grave was buried first and the man was a later addition. But in reconstruction drawings, you do tend to get the whole picture, right? And we don't know who the animals were sacrificed with. So we simply we know a lot less than, well, we only know the finished picture in some ways. So I think reconstruction drawings are incredibly powerful, but they're also an incredibly useful tool to try and think through when you're reconstructing your own understanding of it. But we also have to be aware of how incredibly powerful they are.
And that's the challenge, isn't it? Is that they can be commissioned in 1997 for a museum exhibition. That museum exhibition may have closed in 2002, but it's on the internet and people are using it. It then gets reused in a couple of popular books. And before you know it, it's got a genealogy of its own where you can't, it's really difficult to reconstruct and explain. And I'm guilty of this as much of anyone, both being taken in and also using them myself and going to students, here's an early Anglo-Saxon period grave, or here's a Pictish kist burial, and you're going, what am I doing? And how do we take the students or the audiences on a journey of, when I sometimes show the graves, some of these, really poorly preserved, skeletal remains from some Swedish, site, and the students go, oh, is that it?
That's not sexy
work with that now.
You
work with that. This is what, you can see a bit of one horse tooth and a couple of long bones and a bit of skull. And, it's really
so
difficult.
much nicer in a drawing. So I don't think it's the fault of anyone who produces these drawings or anything, and I don't mean to be critical because I certainly do it myself as well. But there is that problem of, on the internet, things get completely divorced from their context. So you might get reconstruction drawings that actually in their original setting was followed by text with all the nuances and explaining everything, but then it just ends up being divorced and doing the rounds, and then people have that image as the truth, which I think is fascinating. They are an incredibly powerful teaching aid, though.
Yes.
In that you can show them a picture and go, but that's not what it's like, which is fun. There's that really famous drawing of the Ulsberg grave, with half the ship sticking out. Well, that has become the truth, hasn't it?
Yes.
It's not my area on the mound reconstruction there, but I don't think it was quite that clear cut.
No. No, but that's
So,
my understanding. I mean,
yeah,
again, I defer to others, but it's one of those things where you show it and you go,
yeah,
here's in the first year lecture I may show it as, oh, and here's the Osprey Bay ship, and then in the
yeah,
second or third year you may get into some of those problems. But
yeah,
for broader audiences, I mean, now we're in the age of AI and people are
yeah.
creating images of the Viking Age. Oh my God, the things I need therapy to some of the things I've seen online
Oh,
of
no.
some of the reconstructions of the Viking Age, and some of them I have to say, you go, actually, it may be crap, but at least it's something fresh that we can talk about. And I go through moments of sort of, that's fine, it's fine, it's really fine, it doesn't matter. And then I go, oh my God, what are we doing? And
Yeah.
it's, so I mean, where can we go with this in terms of encouraging archaeological literacy or understanding the challenges with these visuals?
Mm. I think there's a lot of interesting work that has been done on it, and I think we just need to carry on the conversation. It's something that I would like to see more of in the bigger conferences, discussions of this, and awareness of the power of images as well. I think as archaeologists we are a little bit obsessed with figures in our text, and that's obviously because we are what we are. We need our site drawings and we need our schematic drawings of the skeletal remains and all of that, and that is all important. But then it's easy to get a little bit carried away with thinking now we need a reconstruction. I'm not saying we don't, but we don't necessarily need them all the time, and we only need them if we think they bring something to the story,
Yeah.
and not just there because we can, if you see what I'm saying. And it's also really funny that I'm having this conversation because I'm actually the least visual minded person you will ever meet.
Okay.
So
Well, that means you're probably the best person to challenge all this, though. That's
I think that's why I got into it, because to me it's not natural to stick drawings in willy-nilly.
no.
So then it means that I have to think about whether or not they actually bring something to the story I'm trying to tell in the paper that I'm writing. And if it is, then I think they're valuable. But if you're just putting it in because you can show some flowing locks and a pretty dress, then maybe not.
And talking about that, I mean, do you think there is a lot of implicit bias in women, particularly in how they're represented?
Very much. I have several examples of that. I mean, you've got oh God, there's so many. So when I do popular lectures these days, I still use the same image that I started using about 10 years ago now, actually, which is a reconstruction drawing from a popular publication on Kaipang. It's a reconstruction drawing of the town, and if you've seen me talk, you've probably seen me use it because it's hilarious. It's like a reconstruction of the harbour. It looks absolutely lovely. It's beautiful. It's full of people doing stuff. It's full of men doing stuff. And then amongst the 40-something men, there's 7 women, and there are as many seagulls in that reconstruction drawing as there are women.
Those seagulls are important.
So important. It was a harbour town, harbour town. And I think that just, it's 20 years old now, that drawing, but you still get that. You still look at like overarching reconstruction drawings, and it's so many men doing stuff, and then you get like women holding babies or cooking. And I used this as an example at a public lecture a few years back, and one of the guys in the audience got really upset, and he said, but somebody had to hold the babies. It's important to hold the babies. I'm like, yes, it's not unimportant to hold the babies. I'm not saying that. I'm also not saying that women couldn't and didn't and shouldn't hold babies, but I'm saying that maybe they also did other things as well. And maybe men held babies in a manly way.
No. I've never heard of that. No. But I mean, it's really depressing to say that you have to have those kind of conversations in an academic context, but it doesn't surprise me. But equally, yeah, I mean, it's the representation, the tasks they're doing. But even in funerals, surely, though we have, I think we've moved. I think it's very positive that we've moved into thinking of the agency of women in funerals, and the women and powerful women and women with different specialist roles that are beyond the standard stereotypes. But we still, they're like strange pockets, aren't they? They're strange little niches. I don't know, maybe that's unfair, but we're happy to have women do those other things, but only because they're special, or I don't know, maybe that's unfair of me, I don't know.
No, it's totally fair. I think it's totally fair, and we like to compartmentalize them, and it's all part of the indexing women thing. That's one of my big beefs with the representation of women is that, yes, you do find more women now and more gender awareness, but they're still not integrated. So you can still look up in the index and you can check out, women doing this, this, and this. And you can't do that with men because they are society. It's like I was saying in the introduction. It's the same with drawings as well, like reconstructions. You tend to compartmentalize them and put them in like very specific settings. And then another thing I find quite funny about some reconstructions is, oh God, how do I say this without accusing people of being sexist? I'm not accusing anyone of being sexist, but there's an awful lot of bodies in some reconstruction drawings. And that's funny because the way that I see Viking Age representations of people and Viking Age representations, like pictorial presentations and Viking Age dress, is that they weren't very focused on bodies. So all these like clinging dresses and
Oh, you mean they're very not
very
revealing, but they're very
sometimes.
shape.
Very, and that doesn't seem to tally with how the Viking Age represented physical beings, if that makes sense.
I mean, you mean all of the portable objects that show, you wouldn't really. I mean, it's only the fact the caption says
head.
a woman or a man.
Yeah.
I'm going, is it? I don't know.
I don't know. There isn't a single body here. It's just like straight up and down, and then you can see in dress and hair, and that's it. And that to me is interesting, and it doesn't seem to always carry on into how we represent visually the Viking Age. And maybe it shouldn't, but again, I think that might be a bit of a modern imposition on the reconstructions, if that makes sense.
That's very interesting, isn't it? There has to be, because, well, without going on a rant, it's not simply about sexualizing, but it's also about our obsession with them being one thing only, or we can't have that ambiguity. So we have to sort of write it or visualize it out.
Yeah. And that's what's so fascinating, because I don't think it's about sexualizing at all, but I think it's about our way of making sense of individuals and people is to classify them into male or female. And it's what we do from the moment you're born. You have to tick a box on whether or not you are male or female. And now, luckily, we are moving towards a society that is a little bit more inclusive. And that's often third boxes, but that's a digression. But to us, bodies is what matters. And I don't necessarily think that that's applicable to the past in the same way. So we need a body in order to make sort of sense of who you are. Whereas I think that's a very modern way of thinking.
And I suppose that's one very positive thing about these mortuary reconstructions is, yes, there are bodies in there. I mean, there may be concerns about how they're represented and stylized, but at least you're getting a sense of that society was full of stuff. It was full of animals. It was full of spaces, and rather than this, just here's a man of the 9th century, here's a child of the 11th century, or it does, at least it does try to show an archaeological context. I suppose that's something positive.
Oh, definitely. And I think there is an honesty in it, in like how we know what we know and what it comes from. So there is that, which is lovely.
So if I were going to ask you a difficult, broad question of what do you think are the major challenges moving forward for both how we deal with Viking period archaeology and its popular reception, what do you think as academics is the biggest challenges we face, or the biggest issues? Are they, as we've said, is it about gender, is it about how we our stereotypes? What would you say is the biggest or one or more things that we need to contend with better or more?
That is a very good question. I think we are lucky working with a period that engages so many people. But with that comes great responsibility, to quote Spider-Man, with great power, etc. And I think that's just something that we need to take very seriously, and not seriously as in let's not have any fun, because it is all very fun, but we do need to think about how and what we communicate, and that goes on many levels. I think it's all connected to gender, because a lot of it is about the stories we tell and why we tell them. I also think that we need to confront the heritage narratives that are constructed around the Viking Age, and how the stories that we create feed into that. And it's I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but it is also a lot of challenges. And the Viking Age is a period that is sometimes used in ways that aren't recognizable to us as academics.
Yeah.
But I also think we have to recognize that they do draw on a lot of the work that we produce, not in ways that we like. So I think the answer lies in public engagement. I think it's easy to be quite divorced from the more sort of public dissemination side of things. And that's something I think we should be really aware of, and work more broadly with the people who do engage in Viking festivals and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to be gained there. And I think there's potentially a lot of promise. So I think for me it's the stereotypes that we might need to tackle, why they are so persistent, but also the ways in which we as academics use them to sell our narratives. Because we all know that if you want to get audiences to come and visit museums, for instance, you will showcase people, you will showcase the things that you know people want to see to attract your audiences. And that's fair enough. But then you have to find the balance of, once you've got the audience in, what story do you tell them? For instance, and I'm referencing that, I suppose, because museums are very much on my mind. Working in a museum, and we're working to open a big Viking Age museum, so there is that.
Yes,
but
of
I
course.
think I think that goes for everything, though. We need to be aware of the difference between attracting interest in our work and sort of then sustaining interest in our work. So I guess what I'm after is that maybe we should work harder to nuance the knowledge that we disseminate. And it's difficult. So like one of my former supervisor, Yulia Lund, I remember I think she'll be fine with me sharing this anecdote, but she had a story out in the Norwegian sort of university, well, like research journal type thing, like public dissemination research journal. And it was about reuse of monuments, if I remember correctly. But because it was Viking Age, the journalist asked her to pick an image and sent her a bunch of images of Viking warriors. And she said, there isn't a warrior in my paper. And also this has got nothing to do with the contents of what you're writing about. And they're like, yeah, but it's the Viking Age, it sells. So she put her foot down, obviously, but I guess it's easy not to. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at, is that we need to be hyper aware of the interest that our work fosters, but also what people see and read might not necessarily be what we produce and write. And that's something we need to think about. Sorry, that was very, very waffly.
No, but that makes me. I mean, this is something I'm really, really interested in, and I don't have an answer for, and I'm just love to hear different perspectives. That we're aware of the challenges, and our academic work is feeding in ways we can't control, and it's not about therefore our failings, because often we don't know when things have been picked up. I mean, frankly, I'm just picking up on criticisms of my own academic work in academia that I hadn't picked up on, and I'm thinking, do I even respond, or do I yeah, that's fair enough, or and then when you see it out, when something comes back to you, go, William says this, and you go, no, I never did. And why are you writing why have you got a whole YouTube video viewed by 150,000 people saying that, and you think, how can I respond to that, other than just to try and keep doing what I'm doing, and not, but it's really tough, and I don't think we have all the answers in this world where our work is out there in ways we can't control, and it's really disconcerting.
That's exactly it, and I think that's fascinating, isn't it? And I don't have the answers, but I think that we do have to be prepared for that. Our work is out there, and we have no control over it.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, I mean, on that sort of slightly disconcerting note, maybe that's a wrap in terms of our conversation. But I think if we'll put in the description links to some of your key publications and where people can find you, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
And this is just for introducing people to your exciting ongoing work, and really just to sort of show the really cool stuff that's being done in Viking period archaeology, gender archaeology, thinking about art and archaeology, and just thank you so much for giving us this sort of insight into your busy world, and let's just keep on having these conversations, and exploring and challenging all the nonsense about the Vikings, but also the cool stuff.
Yeah. Totally. No, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been really good fun.
For relaxing times, make it Archaeodeath time.